Thanks, Gail. And as she said, thank you for coming out today on this cold day. If you had a friend who smoked like a chimney and drank like a fish and had a family to support, you would fear for his health and the well-being of his children. And you might be puzzled that he didn't himself see that there was a problem, or puzzled that he wasn't doing anything about it. For many of us, this is the situation we face with respect to climate change. The perils are clear, the solution's tough but doable, and yet our friend does little or nothing to change his ways. Now, the difference is that it's not our friend who's in trouble, it's us. And if what scientists tell us is true, we need to act now. If our house is on fire, it doesn't help if the fire department is on extended vacation. Yet we're told that after recent US elections, there will be no meaningful climate change legislation in this country for at least 2 years. And in a world in which American leadership is essential, this is not good news. Well, we're not going to debate the reality of climate change today, any more than whether the Earth is flat or round. Instead, we're asking what is to be done? How can we help speed up change? In an initiative in which participating Vanderbilt faculty would commit half their research time and a portion of their teaching for the next 5 years to addressing these questions would not be out of place. But that's not on the agenda. Short of that, however, there are pockets at Vanderbilt of serious concern and discussion, and I'm pleased and delighted that 3 of the brightest people on the Vanderbilt campus who've been talking and thinking about these issues will address us here today. People, in fact, who have, if you've been loyal and come to all these series, you will have met before. I'll very briefly go through them and introduce them all at once so that we can then have a panel without more introductions. We're going to start off with Mike Vandenbergh. Mike holds the Tarkington Chair, as you can see on the screen, in Teaching Excellence. He's director of our Environmental Law Program and of our Climate Change Research Network. Mike Vandenbergh is a leading scholar in environmental and energy law, whose research explores the relationship between formal legal regulation and informal social regulation of individual and corporate behavior. He's the author of key papers on climate change in many of the leading law journals. And it's worth noting that he was chief of staff of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, under the Clinton administration. Beth Conklin, our second panelist, is a cultural and medical anthropologist who specializes in the ethnography of indigenous peoples of the Amazon, of Amazonia. Her research focuses on the anthropology of the body, religion and ritual, health and healing, death and mourning, the politics of indigenous rights, environmentalism, and cultural responses and religious responses to climate change. Her most famous book is Consuming Grief, Compassionate Cannibalism in an Amazonian Society, and she's been the co-director of an interdisciplinary research group on ecology and spirituality at Vanderbilt. Finally, Michael Bess, who is our Chancellor's Professor of History at Vanderbilt and a specialist in 20th century Europe, with a particular interest, which is odd for a historian, in the future. I mean, of course, we might think, well, there's a huge potential there, but that, I guess, depends on how much future there is. Particularly the social and cultural impacts of technological change. He's the author of 3 books, and he's currently working on a project entitled Icarus II, Justice and Identity in a Post-Bionic Civilization. So we're going to start off with Professor Mike Vandenbergh. Mike.
Well, thank you, David, and my apologies to my fellow panel members and to David for having only my slide up here the whole time. You must think that we all have big egos as professors, but mine's not quite big enough to justify only my name being there, but it just, I happened to be giving the first slide and it got set up first. Secondly, let me just say that I know enough about this issue, and there's a lot of empirical research on this, to know that when some of you heard that I was the EPA Chief of Staff, and particularly in Clinton administration, a little switch went off in your brain, and you're not hearing me right now. And so I hope that you'll turn that switch back on. I'm not the big government guy. I like government when it's necessary. I gave a talk at Belmont a few years ago called Climate Change for People Who Like Small Government. It was actually a longer talk than you might think. But I do ask just that as much as you can, that you keep your mind open. Again, there's some really interesting research that suggests that literally the temperature on the day in which people are surveyed about whether they think climate change is happening affects whether or not they think it's happening. And more disturbingly, whether they're liberal or conservative affects whether or not they think it's warm or hot or cold on that day. So to the extent possible, if Vanderbilt can bring something to this community, it's in part to help us all get out of our usual comfort zone. And I hope I can, and I'm afraid I probably will, do a little bit of that here. So let me just say a word. We have a lot of different resources at Vanderbilt. David mentioned them. We have a climate change research network. We do several speakers a year. We have an Institute for Energy and the Environment. A lot is going on around campus at any given time, and I hope you will take advantage of that. You can email me if you wish. It's Vandenbergh at Vanderbilt. You can Google me to find that, and I'm always happy to put you on our email list and things like that. So I hope you'll participate in what I think is a very intellectually vibrant environment that we have, and we hope to make it as open as we can. These are just examples of some of the kinds of papers that we have prepared in recent years. So the question that David asked is, is climate change action done? Are we over? And I think the answer emphatically is yes, for the next couple of years on a governmental level. The leaders of more than 30 nations are meeting in Cancun yesterday, today, tomorrow. Don't expect anything significant to come from that. I wish I could tell you differently. It won't happen. So we're not going to see something, if what you worry about is international agreements on climate, that's not going to happen anytime soon. What about on the domestic level? As David signaled, cap and trade is dead for at least the next 2 years, maybe for a longer period than that. Some people say, well, we should have had a carbon tax instead, but one of the reasons cap and trade failed is it was called a cap and tax, and so tax is even less likely to happen. Instead, what will Congress be doing? It will be cutting incentives for energy efficiency. It will be blocking renewable energy standards. It will be hauling EPA in front of Congress to do oversight hearings. It will be putting appropriations riders on bills to prevent EPA from regulating. So I think Congress will be active, but not in terms of trying to reduce the carbon growth curve in the United States or around the world. It'll be focused more on jobs and near-term issues in the economy. So where might we look then if we're thinking about governmental action? Well, possibly some federal EPA action, but again, I think less than you would expect, because I think budgets will be cut, and I think Congress will likely do some things that will keep the agency from acting under its existing authorities. We will probably, though, see some action at the state level. Roughly half of the U.S. population is in a state that has some form of a cap and trade program, or will very soon. California and about a dozen of the northeastern states have a cap and trade program right now. And will that continue in the future? Probably a little less than we might have had before November, but still quite a bit. So the country is deeply divided on some of these climate issues. And at the state level, around the country, again, roughly half the U.S. population is going to be in a state that will be doing quite a lot to reduce carbon emissions in the future. What I want to talk about, though, we tend to default to government, and the other level I would suggest is at the local level. And I think we will continue to see quite a bit of activity there. Hundreds, close to 1,000 mayors have signed the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. Even if climate is not the issue, many cities have realized that energy efficiency is a way toward prosperity in various different communities, and we'll continue to see, I think, quite a bit of activity on that level. I want to switch a little bit, though, and say, should we default immediately to government? Or are there non-governmental solutions? Not total solutions, but gap fillers. If you listen to the climate scientists whom I talk to, we have 5, 10, 20 years to sharply reduce the growth curve in carbon emissions that we now face, and after that we lose control of the issue. From then on out, it's nature's game, and we can do what we want to, but there'll be enough carbon in the atmosphere to begin to drive feedback effects that will change our future and our children's and grandchildren's future without our control for the most part. So we have a period here. What are we going to do? And what I work on is various different non-governmental solutions that can potentially change that carbon growth curve in a significant way. I want to present two of them today. One of them is what we call the behavioral wedge. This is a paper with Tom Dietz, who's an environmental sociologist, several environmental social psychologists, and Jonathan Gilligan, who is an earth scientist. And what we've done here is to try to say, is there a way without substantial lifestyle changes, without regulation, but with more information and sometimes with financial incentives, but only those incentives that would be net positive from an economic perspective, that is, the benefits of saving energy, for example, would be greater than whatever the financial incentive was, can we make a significant change in energy use and carbon emissions in the United States? And our conclusion is yes, that the U.S. Right now has committed to, I don't think we'll achieve this, but we've committed to try to reduce U.S. carbon emissions by 17% from 2005 levels by 2020. And what we've concluded is the reasonably achievable, not perfect, but reasonably achievable emissions reductions that we could get by 2010 just through those things that I mentioned, changing household behavior in ways that are non-regulatory, not lifestyle change requiring, and net positive from an economic perspective, that we could get 123 million metric tons of carbon emissions, which is about a third of the U.S. total that was committed to at Copenhagen, a 17% number. How would we do that? Well, what we did is we looked at a whole range of, there are 17 action types here and 33 different actions, different kinds of things that can be done at the household level. We looked at what the technical potential is. If everyone in the country who is not now doing this activity did them, what's the total amount of carbon you would get? But then we realized that that's not really a fair way to do that because many of us aren't going to do various different things. For example, carpooling. If everyone in the country who is not now carpooling would do so, you would get tremendous reductions in energy use and carbon emissions, but we all know better. How many of us carpooled here today? Actually, we did. Yes, good. See, and this is an unusual audience. Many more of you did than we typically would see, but we try to be realistic. So we took the very best social science, the very best empirical studies, and said, what's the behavioral plasticity? How changeable is the behavior as to each one of these categories of actions? And we applied those, and what we came up with was that the current household share in the United States is about 30 to 40% of all U.S. energy use and carbon emissions. And we could reduce that share by about 20% if we just took this set of actions given very plausible amounts of behavioral plasticity. Now, you might say, well, that can't be very big, right? That's equal to all of the carbon emissions from the country of France, okay? So we could, with no new regulatory changes, with some financial incentives that are net economically beneficial, and with no major lifestyle change, reduce as much carbon from the U.S. as all of France emits in a year. What's the barrier to doing that? The biggest one is in part that we don't think of ourselves as big carbon emitters, right? And so here's an example from a U.S. Commerce Committee House of Representatives report. Says that residential share is only 5% of U.S. emissions, right? If it's only 5%, why are we worried about it? Well, here's one from the Commerce Department 2 years later that recognizes that that last number, 5%, excluded all household driving and all household electricity and other use where the energy is generated off-site. If you put those in, now all of a sudden households are 31%. Sometimes those figures go up as high as 42 or 43. And now that looks like a big area to begin to focus on. So part of the problem is how you frame these issues. Another one is who makes money from this? All right, this is a headline from the Wall Street Journal: decline in power use worries utilities. Industry concerned the drop goes beyond the downshift in the nation's economy, right? So, oh my goodness, people are starting to conserve. What are we going to do about that? Someone once referred to me, an industry executive called energy efficiency and conservation revenue erosion to me, right? So long as that's true, we have a hard time changing this line, right? And there are a lot of ways to do that, but someone needs to find a way to make money when we use less energy, if it's going to happen systemically. This is one I put in because Michael's going to talk about this topic a little bit. Another question is, well, should we be in the business as individuals or as government in changing people's norms? And my answer, if you can't read this in the back, it says, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. I didn't do this. This isn't some lefty proposal. This is from the Second World War, from the National Archives, right? When we have an issue that we care about, we're willing to change norms, and we're willing to drive behavior. So part of the question is this one of those issues or not? Maybe it's not. But it certainly seems like we do that at times. Okay, what's the kind of thing that you might do to achieve those kinds of behavioral wedge outcomes that I just mentioned? Well, one example that I'm just beginning to work on a little bit here is we tend to focus on new construction when we talk about green architecture. But new homes are about 1% of the housing market. 99% of the housing market is not affected by new homes in any given year. Right? So how could we change existing homes? One answer might be, what if there were a reliable label that was certified by some firm that said, look, it could be an NGO, that said, this house has done the 5 or 10 things that you need to do in order to make a house energy efficient, right? And that gave you a number that you could work with. Now, perhaps a lot of people wouldn't want to know about that. A lot of people wouldn't want government to do that. Proposals to do this have been killed in states like Massachusetts, which isn't known for being on the right side of the political spectrum. But what about in a private marketplace? Why isn't there a private label where you can reliably, quickly, and easily understand when you buy a used home, so to speak, that it is actually more energy efficient than others? And wouldn't that drive people to make their homes more efficient? Just one idea of how the private marketplace could actually work for that part of the population that has a preference for energy efficiency and lower carbon emissions. Okay, even if we do all we can in the US, we're still going to face a big problem unless we deal with the global problem. That red line that you see there is the developing countries' carbon emissions increases. The green line is global emissions increases. 80% of the growth in carbon emissions from today till 2050, which are expected to double overall, 80% of that growth will occur in China and India and Indonesia and other developing world countries. Right? So it's not enough for the US to stop. In my view, it's not enough for us to say we're not doing anything until you do something, but it's truly the case that we both need to do something if we're going to avoid being in atmospheric concentrations of carbon that in past time have indicated very large sea level rises and things like that. So how could we deal with those countries? Well, the international efforts so far have not been successful, and we're at least looking at several more years of failure in those areas. Is there something else we can do? So one of the areas I'm working on is how do we bend that carbon growth curve in the developing countries as well as the developed countries? Here's one possibility. Right now, exports account for about half of China's CO2 emissions. The US and Europe account for 40% or so of all of China's exports. Different studies have suggested somewhere in the range of 14% to 28% of all of China's carbon emissions supply us and the consumers in the EU with goods. Right? So we actually have some opportunity based on our consumption to influence what happens in terms of China's carbon emissions. We know that firms can have their emissions influenced directly. If I say I'm only going to buy a good from you if you make it with lower carbon, you're going to try to make it with lower carbon. You then have an industry within China or India or the US for that matter that is beginning to invest in lower carbon, and they want those policies to ratify what they are doing. So consumer-based and investor-based pressure on firms through supply chains can actually have a very large effect on the carbon emissions of foreign countries and the businesses in foreign countries, even absent any international agreement. What's an example of that? Walmart does $18 billion a year business with China. If it were a trading partner, it would be about the 6th largest national trading partner of China. And it's asking its Chinese suppliers to reduce carbon emissions, I believe, by roughly 20% or not. An interesting study would be to ask, is that having more effect on China's carbon growth than some other international agreement that's out there? I think it very well might be. We don't have the data on that. What might we do to affect that? Well, we might develop a private carbon label for goods. Would you buy that tray of mini vegetables if you knew it had all been flown in from Chile and it was associated with tens of pounds of carbon, even though it's being sold in a green market? Right? Would carbon emissions, if associated with products, actually change your behavior? If they would, that will then change the behavior of the firm that then buys that good, and now we're using the private market as a way to begin to change behavior in the US and carbon emissions in the US, as well as the carbon emissions in foreign countries, and beginning to change incentives, all of which can occur in the absence of the governmental activity, which won't occur in the next couple of years. So that's an idea, a global carbon labeling scheme that begins to drive markets because of consumer preferences for a different carbon growth curve. Lastly, David just mentioned the carbon issues. My understanding is that this year was likely to be the warmest year we've had. If it won't be the warmest, it'll be one of the 3 warmest. And the last decade was clearly now the warmest decade that we've had since temperature began being recorded in 1880. So with that up there, I'll turn it over to our next speaker.
Mike, can I close this?
Absolutely.
Okay. So as an anthropologist, I tend to think in terms of things like culture and identity and aspiration, how it is that we imagine the people that we want to be and the kind of world that we want to leave for our children and grandchildren. And so my argument here is that we need to think bigger. We need to think more broadly about this problem of climate change that is upon us and how we are going to make our responses to this part of a way of creating a more positive future. So I'd like to turn to an essay by Michael Pollan, who writes primarily about food issues. I know that a lot of you are familiar with some of his work. And in an essay called Why Bother, he asked this question of why bother making the kinds of changes in our own lives that Mike is suggesting we feasibly could make, that might make a real difference. So in answer to this question of why bother, Pollan writes, for us to wait for legislation or technology to solve the problem of how we're living our lives suggests we're not really serious about changing, something our politicians cannot fail to notice. They won't move until we do. Indeed, to look to leaders and experts, to laws and money and grand schemes to save us from our predicament represents precisely the kind of thinking, passive, delegated, dependent for solutions on specialists, that helped get us into this mess in the first place. It's hard to believe that the same sort of thinking could help get us out of it. So what I want to do today is to just challenge us all to think more broadly about how coming up with positive responses to climate change, both in terms of trying to slow its rate of coming upon us and in terms of helping the world cope with the changes that almost inevitably will occur, how could that become part of creating an actually better, more abundant, richer quality of life for us in the future? So in my model of positive social change, I see 2 key points in changing the frame of how we're approaching climate change in our culture and in our politics. And these 2 key points are, first, I think we really need to break out of the rut of the unfounded assumption that ecology and economy are always opposed to each other. We need to think about how a better economic future with more jobs, with more clean energy for more people who need it. And David and I just got back from a trip to Brazil in which we spent a week in the Amazon where huge hydroelectric dams are being built. And we're very aware that people in developing countries have aspirations for air conditioning, for refrigeration, for things that are actually going to improve the quality of their lives in ways that need to be addressed. And so the question is, how can we build a clean energy future, a future that will give people more, not less, of what they really want? So I think the first key then is to break out of this rut of always assuming that positive ecological changes will have negative impacts on economy. We need to think more creatively, and I think we're capable of that. And secondly, I think we need to shift from a negative sort of pollution-centered paradigm in thinking about the environment to a more positive politics of possibility, to see this issue in terms of improving the quality of human life in terms of values that people already hold, things that we already care about, things like human health, saving money, efficiency, creating new jobs, community, dealing with the time deficit and the pressures that so many of us feel. How can positive solutions actually bring us a better quality of life? I think that thinking in these terms is really, really important for all of us to engage in, and I think it's also important in terms of shifting the political ruts and the political divisions that seem to being forced upon us. Thinking about the human face of environmental issues is important because it's in human terms, let's face it, that most of us care most strongly. Yes, there's a certain percentage of the population that really can be motivated to save plants, to save animals, to save natural places, and a vast majority of the population definitely cares about those things. But that kind of non-human-centered environmental thinking will always get trumped by the economic arguments, by the quality of life arguments. So our challenge is to think creatively in terms of what do positive solutions to climate change have to do with improving human life. This is a point that has come through really strongly in the learning that all of us did in the project that David mentioned that I co-directed with him on ecology and spirituality at Vanderbilt, an interdisciplinary faculty project that Mike was also involved in, and Michael for a while also, in which we really tried to understand these issues about culture and cultural politics in our local community. And perhaps the most transformative learning experience for us that came out of this was the outreach that we did to try to engage religious congregations and religious leaders in the community in conversation about environmental issues. In 2006, we held the first Nashville Forum, first and only so far, although perhaps it's time for another one, the first Nashville Forum on Christianity and the environment. And we had 130 wonderful, highly motivated people from Middle Tennessee come together to seriously talk about these issues. They came from all different denominations across the spectrum, but some of the most powerful learning experiences that we had were engaging with the very strong environmental commitments that are coming out of the evangelical community, particularly Trevecca Nazarene and Lipscomb, are developing perspectives on the environment that really drew us to think more broadly and to get us out of our ruts of thinking about the environment in the terms that we had been. And one of the things that we learned most strongly from our fellow Nashvillians was that these environmental issues are human issues, and they're issues of social justice, and that when we think about them in those terms, there's a much broader network of people who really care and who really can be committed. And this is not just instrumental, but it's imaginative, it's moral, it's challenging us to really think what's at stake here. So, religiously motivated environmentalists insist that climate change is not just an environmental problem, it's a moral problem, it's a human problem, and that its solutions need to keep human interests and the goal of improving human quality of life at the center. And religious environmentalists across the spectrum, but the evangelicals in particular, link ecology and environmentalism to social justice and concern for the least of these, for the poor and disadvantaged of the world, and particularly for the poor in developing countries and in our own communities. So this resolutely people-centered view contrasts with the older, more secular conservationist view of nature as something separate that needs to be protected. And it also rejects the common assumption that up till now has been widely shared among at least parts of both the right and the left, that ecological well-being and economic prosperity are incompatible. So I think that the guiding principle we need to pursue in our own thinking about this, and I think here's where every one of us in this room can think imaginatively, creatively, is where do we find these convergences? Where do we find the convergences between the things that we need to do, the kinds of things that Mike is outlining, and the positive changes that we can bring into our own lives in terms of saving money in our own households, improving efficiency, but also improving the health of our families, our children, our communities. So we need to look for interventions where change is motivated not just by environmental concerns, but also by human concerns, where we really recognize climate change as a human issue, as a moral issue. I have some examples of this that maybe I could talk about later, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to let Michael Bess come and speak to you first.
Hi, I teach a course every year at Vanderbilt on World War II. And one of the things that's really striking about World War II, when you really get into the nitty-gritty of immersing yourself back in that era, is the extent to which not just Americans, but people in other countries, but I'm thinking specifically here about the United States, the extent to which people mobilized, changed their lives over dramatically. Speaking of the home front, changing the way they worked, the way they consumed, the way they traveled, a very dramatic mobilization of our society because of a common, an agreement, a commonly perceived threat. Everyone agreed that the threat was there, and everyone agreed that the threat was very serious and immediate. And so Mike put up the slide about riding in the car with Adolf Hitler. And every aspect, this is what they mean by total war. Every aspect of our lives, of people's lives during that time, was touched profoundly by this challenge. This is tragically not the case with climate change, with global warming. Because even though the vast majority of scientists today concur that human-caused climate change is a serious problem and a serious threat, the population at large seems to be far more divided than the community of scientists, because the issue has unfortunately become politicized as a left-right issue. And it's true that that was the case in the early years of World War II before Pearl Harbor. Americans were divided on whether or not to participate as well, and then the Japanese resolved that question for us. We don't have a Pearl Harbor with climate change and global warming. We don't have that kind of wake-up call. Unfortunately, there's two different respects in which the World War II example and climate change are different. First of all, there's the question of the commonly perceived threat, so the division that we have in our society. This puzzles me sometimes, why this had to become a left-right issue. It seems to me that people on both the left and the right care about what's going to happen to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and have sincerely and fervently felt concern for what the future is going to bring to their children and great-grandchildren down the line. So it doesn't seem to me that this was an issue that had to become a left-right issue, but unfortunately it did. The second problem and difference from World War II is even among those who, among us in the population who accept the conclusions of the scientists about the gravity of this threat, the threat itself still remains something relatively remote, relatively abstract, something that to a certain degree is still wreathed in uncertainty. The scientists, because they're rigorous about telling us what they do know and what they don't know, have to acknowledge that they don't have a crystal ball. They can't tell us exactly when global warming is going to become so severe that it's going to drastically throw our lives upside down. They can't even tell us exactly how severe it's going to be with complete certainty, the way that they can tell you, with near certainty, well, you have this disease, I'll give you this antibiotic and you'll get better. So World War II is very different in this regard. The threat was immediate and nearly unanimously perceived as very serious. With global warming, the threat is out there, 50, 100, 150 years. We're not quite sure. How bad is it going to be? There's a range of predictions about how bad it's going to be, ranging from pretty bad to not so bad to catastrophic. And this has made it very difficult for us to mobilize in the way that we did during the 1940s. And here, it's interesting. The Europeans have adopted a rather different approach. The European Union has formally accepted a legal principle known as the precautionary principle. When a threat is this catastrophic, when the threat that people are identifying is of a cataclysmic nature, you don't wait for certainty about it, because by then it may well be too late. You act now to take measures to decrease the risk of that threat coming about, and you're willing to say, you know, some of these measures may turn out in retrospect to have been unnecessary, but we'd rather err on the side of caution than face catastrophic consequences when it's too late to reverse the damage. This precautionary principle was formulated by a German philosopher named Hans Jonas back in the 1980s, has now become the basis for European law regarding a lot of different kinds of environmental regulation. And I think that's the only way that we can approach the disparity in mobilization energy, mobilization motivation, let's say, that we have. World War II, we were motivated. That was not a problem. In order to get more motivated here, I think we need to look at this notion of the precautionary principle and use it to guide our actions. On the webpage, David Wood put up a question for today. To what extent will technology play a role in counteracting global warming? I think there are two varieties. David mentioned I'm abandoning my career as a historian and becoming a futurologist. There are two varieties of technologies that are being imagined by people today to address climate change. One is 10 years ago was only considered really as science fiction. It's mega projects, and the word that's now being used to describe them is geoengineering. For example, you've got global warming. Well, that's caused by these greenhouse gases and the sun's energies coming down. One solution is, of course, when you walk out in the desert on a sunny day, you can carry a parasol. So what if we put a parasol between the sun and the earth? If you put it out far enough, the shadow that it would cast would encompass the entire planet, and so we get a little shade. This might not be a permanent solution, but it might buy us 50 or 100 years to re-engineer our society so that we're producing fewer greenhouse gases. Put the parasol up there between the sun and the earth. A similar concept would be simply to deliberately put particles of various sorts, from water vapor to other things, into the atmosphere, closer to the planet, once again producing this kind of parasol, umbrella effect, shielding the Earth from some of the sun's radiation, and therefore reducing the global warming. These were science fiction novels up until 10 years ago. Now you're seeing scientists seriously looking at it. I subscribe to Scientific American, and you actually see serious scientists envisioning how this might come about and starting to say, well, what would be the side effects of putting us in partial shade all the time? What would happen to plants and animals, and what would happen to agriculture, and what would happen to the oceans? What would be the side effects? Yeah, we may cool the planet, but what would be the side effects? The problem with these geoengineering projects, these mega projects, is we really don't know what the answer the answer is to these questions about the risk. And so, rightly, I think people are cautious. Let's be careful before we start messing with the planet as a whole in that way. And the other kinds of technologies are the ones that Mike Vandenbergh was mentioning, technologies that are small, that are, can be applied in more gentle, point source, each of us taking some responsibility for them at a much more direct level in our daily lives. A compact fluorescent light bulb, which uses 1/4 the energy of an incandescent, is a perfect example of this. But there are many examples. Another example, maybe it's less popular among many environmentalists, would be new forms of nuclear generators that are much safer because of their design than the old kinds that we used to have back in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, or the kinds that we still use today. Could we build a new generation of nuclear generators to provide for our electricity needs, or at least part of them? I think technologies can and should be a major part of our response to the crisis. I think that the notion that we can only rely on sort of natural, solutions is not going to work. I think the technology can be applied if it's applied carefully, intelligently, with an eye to hubris and the limitations of our knowledge about the consequences of what we do. Technology, I think, is going to be an essential component of how humanity responds to this challenge. I think I'll just stop there.
Well, it's customary for me to ask a few questions at this point, but I think we should throw custom to the wind and invite questions from you, from the audience, because I know a lot of people are engaged with these issues, and we have 3 wonderful speakers. So if you have questions you'd like to address to any one of our speakers or to all 3 of them, find a microphone. We've got a mic over there and another one over there.
2 mics up here.
And 2 mics, yes. Yes.
I'm not sure who this question would go to, anyone who's willing to answer. It strikes me that the biggest part of our problem is that the pro-environmental stance is associated with being anti-capitalist, which I think is pretty bogus, that there are a lot of 19th century polluting industries that would kind of like to have that believed and seem to be doing a very good job of getting their message out there. My question is, how do we win the information war on this?
So I'll take the first step, although I've got a anthropologist and a historian next to me. So I think one of the answers is that, and there's really good work by something called the Cultural Cognition Project. So I'd suggest just Googling that if you get a chance. Dan Kahan at Yale and some other people have done work on this that suggests that people, again, they're given a study, a newspaper article that says climate change is a very serious issue, and the answer is more regulation. And if you take that article and you expose it to a group that's been divided into different subgroups, and one group that comes out on the liberal end of the spectrum, they end up thinking that climate change was more harmful than they thought before they saw that article. And if you expose that same article to a group who ascribe to traditional conservative notions, they'll end up going back and revising their sense of how serious the climate problem is based on what they think the solution was, if they thought it was more regulation. The obverse is also true. They took the same groups of people, they exposed them to an article that says climate change is really serious and the answer is more nuclear power. And liberals reading that went back and they reduced the extent to which they were worried about climate change. And conservatives now all of a sudden went back and increased the extent to which. So there's clearly a link between the remedy and the perception of the problem, which is not rational on a core level. At least David's the philosopher here. I'll let him decide what rationality is. But so from my perspective, one of the answers has to be that we need to be open-minded about what the potential remedies are. I think we have to get beyond, we have to understand, I think we need a national dialogue about the climate science. People I talk to have no sense in the general public of how serious the climate scientists that I talk to informally think the future may look. They don't have a clue at how bad things might be based on not just models, but how things were in the past when we look at paleoclimatology. And when you have that sense, then you begin saying, well, what are the range of different remedies that are acceptable to my political construct? But maybe we need to first talk politics and put that off on the side, and then we can talk about the climate science a little bit more once we've gotten the remedy problem from being such a screen as it now is.
We all
Yeah,
need to use
I would just think that say that the anti-capitalist frame on this is going to be blown out of the water, is being blown out of the water by the thousands and thousands of American entrepreneurs and companies who are seeing major money-making opportunities in trying to respond to this and come up with solutions. So it's a ridiculous frame. Hopefully, it will self-destruct on its own.
My own, I know more about France than I do about the United States on this issue because I actually wrote a book about the impact of environmentalism in France specifically. And one of the things that was really striking is the ideology of environmentalism, of the ecology movement, starting back in the 60s. I don't know if you remember Small is Beautiful and Zero Growth and this sort of we have to challenge the notion that economies need to be perpetually growing in order to be healthy. This was in fact, this was the interesting challenge that got me interested in studying environmentalism in the first place. One of the paradoxical things that I discovered in doing my research was by the year 2000, the most rapidly growing segment of the French economy was green technologies. Other segments were flat or barely growing at all or in decline, but dramatic growth was going on in the sector of the French economy that had to do with addressing all different kinds of environmental challenges.
Thanks. Other question back there?
I'll take the bait on nuclear. Nuclear power is not an answer to climate change. It's not really a solution to go from one environmental problem or evil, that of carbon, to radiation. The realities of radiation just do not change. And any of the so-called new generations of nuclear power, first off in the Tennessee Valley, they've had to abandon the new so-called new design, the AP1000, that TVA was going to build at Bellefonte. They're going back to finishing the original Bellefonte Unit 1, which is basically like finishing a Mustang at this point, a 1966 Mustang that was probably designed in the 50s. And the other one is using nuclear. At this point, it's been 60 years. There is no solution for the high-level waste that is created. And it's building up at every one of the power plants. It's sitting there at Sequoia, it's sitting there at Browns Ferry, and it's sitting there at Watts Bar. And the failure of Yucca Mountain there's many reasons. You can go into it, whether it was political or physical, but the reality of that waste, you gotta realize it's not spent fuel. It's highly irradiated, poisonous material that has to be isolated from the environment for literally millions of years. And to put that, make that decision so that we can have electricity and leave that to our future generations just to solve climate change, which can be solved by energy efficiency, by solar, by wind, by other new technologies that I think in 50 years are going to just make it seem ridiculous to boil water with fission. Thank you, and you can respond as you will.
I have one quick thought, which is, and maybe Michael, who knows more about the nuclear issues, can deal with this, but as a general rule, I think one of the things we all have to do is we have to get our mind around the scale of the problem we face. And again, if you're looking for really good sources to get information on this, Nathan Lewis, who is a professor at Caltech and someone I'm working on a paper with, is a real energy expert, and he has a great lecture called Powering the Planet. It's available on his website at Caltech. And the kind of examples he gives, I think, helps hold our feet to the fire. The problem is much bigger than we think. Given anticipated populations growth in the world in 2050, we need to roughly double the amount of energy being generated. And so what does that mean if the answer is nuclear power? It means building every single day between now and 2050 a nuclear power plant of average size. What if the answer is solar power? It means arraying 27 square kilometers of solar photovoltaic film at current efficiency levels, and that's assuming that we get 1% gain in efficiency every year between now and 2050. So I think one of the things that has opened my mind on this issue is that we have some really hard trade-offs to make. I don't know what the right answer is on nuclear power for myself, but I know that we can't pretend that the choices aren't as hard as they are simply because in the climate area, the harm arises 50 or 100 years from now. The thing that we don't tend to talk about is if it arises the way some of the climate scientists think it might, it doesn't go away in 50 or 100 years. It lasts for thousands of years. So when we're talking about dealing with jobs or poverty or whatever, we're facing really difficult questions. The scope of the problem is big, and the tail, the length of the end of that problem is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years long. So that's my optimistic comment.
Beth, did you want to say anything?
Just quickly.
Yeah. Mike has done a good job of addressing it. The problem is the scale. Even if we did every possible thing that we could in terms of conservation and switching toward alternative sources, we still have a large gap. And this was shocking to me when I discovered it. And unless we're going to accept very drastic reductions in our standard of living. And so one possibility, I guess I'm just saying, I've heard about new types of reactors that are inherently more stable. I've also heard about reactors that would, so to speak, chomp the fuel as the spent fuel from older generation reactors as the fuel that they use to generate their own fission or fusion process. I think what I'm saying is the scale of the problem also was very sobering to me when I saw it, and so I began to say, maybe I need to be open. I was very closed to nuclear power for all the excellent reasons that you described. That is the ultimate unsustainable thing, to leave your grandchildren with piles of this horribly poisonous stuff. But what if you could find a technology that ate that bad stuff and then turned it into energy? That does not seem to me to be an immoral thing to try to consider for our future.
Okay, we may have time for one quick one, or two quick ones, and one not so quick.
I'll try to make one quick. Something that, is immediate and can't be ignored are climate refugees. And it's happening right now. I'm a Katrina survivor, and at least I had another state to run to. What about the people where islands, and it was on the internet just this week, some have already gone underwater and whole cultures and, are gone. Where do they run? And they had the least amount of, put out the least amount of carbon or whatever to cause this situation, yet they're the first ones affected. Where are all these people supposed to go? And what will happen to them? And even if people, just from a humanitarian standpoint, just it seems like it would be almost even a security threat to other countries. What are we going to do with all these people, and where do they go? Thank you.
Anyone like to respond to that?
Beth can say more on some of those issues, but it is certainly the case that the Department of Defense has been looking at and issuing public reports about concern about migration. What happens, a large percentage of the population of Bangladesh is a yard or less above sea level. What happens when that population gets displaced in a part of the world that has historical conflict? So it's clearly a part of defense planning in the future, and that's putting aside the moral issues that might arise about putting someone's country underwater.
Yeah, last question back there.
Yes. Do you have any ratio information on, like, say, 20 years from now, what the expected population will be and what the expected amount of energy that person will need and how it's going to be produced? Because I opened up the newspaper this morning and there were 2 whole pages of dead people. They will not need any electricity. Now, can you give us some kind of ratio on
Sure,
that?
sure. I can't speak to those specific people, but but I know more about 2050 just because that's a number that we tend to use in the work that I do. In 2050, the best current projections are the global population will go from a current 7 billion to 9+ billion. And that's assuming some leveling off that we haven't yet seen, and that China does not substantially back off of its one-child policies. So that's that. And in the average energy use right now, I think of it in terms of carbon emissions. The global average carbon emissions is about 5 tons per person around the world. The United States is about 20 right now. We're among the highest in the world. Australia, Canada, Kuwait, Qatar, or others. Where do we need to be if we're going to be at levels that in paleoclimatology they suggest we don't have catastrophic climate change? We need to all be at 2 tons per capita in 2050. Who's at 2 tons per capita today? China is now about 5, so they need to go down by half, and yet they're going up. They put as much coal-fired electricity on a few years ago as would supply all the electricity needs of France. Where's 2 tons per capita? That's India today. So in 2050, somehow, we have to get to the place where we have a happy, fruitful society that is generating as much carbon as India generates today per capita.
I think it's time to thank our panelists for